All right, everybody, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are joining us from, where you are located. We are so happy to see you today. And if you want to, as you're coming in, you may use the chat function and let us know where you're joining us from. Thank you so much. We are delighted to welcome you to our webinar titled, What Role Do AI and MT Have in Language Access? Alrighty. For those that have not joined us before, my name is Analia, and I am the Manager of Training and Curriculum here at Cross Cultural Communications, the largest international training agency for community, educational, and medical interpreting. I will be your host for today's 1 hour webinar. Also, with us today behind the scenes is my colleague Andrew Hall, Cross Cultural Communications Manager. Andrew will manage the chat and will provide useful information throughout the webinar. Before we begin, and welcome everybody, so glad to see people are joining us from everywhere. So before we begin, and as we wait also for the rest of the people to join us, I would like to share some CC updates. Today is just very brief. Registration for the Spring TCII TOT will be up on our website maybe in the next couple of weeks. Attending our online training of trainers program and learn how to lead your own sessions of the only national 40-hour license certificate program for community, educational, and medical interpreting. This international famous TOT has licensed over 400 trainers across the United States and also worldwide to deliver TCII. And I see that somebody said that they are joining us from Peru, so that's wonderful. Okay, also I wanted to let you know our next webinar will be on December 13th. Our speaker, her name is Kelly Enriquez. She's our presenter, and her topic will be interpreting for gender and sexual diversity, a very interesting topic. Now, I will go over a few points regarding the webinar. The webinar presentation will last about 40 to 45 minutes, followed by a 15 to 20-minute Q&A period during which you can ask questions to our presenter. During the webinar, please keep the Q&A feature open and use the Q&A to submit your questions to our presenter. Now, for any other comments or questions for us here at Cross Cultural Communications, please use the chat feature instead. And if you want everybody to see your comments in the chat, please make sure the chat is set to everyone. Lastly, if you want to stay after the webinar is over and our presenter leaves, if you want to ask any questions to Andrew and myself, we'll be happy to answer any questions regarding both cross-cultural communications and Blue Horizons. Now, this webinar has been approved for CE use, and I know that's very important to all of us, right, that are interpreters. Please, please, please remember 24 hours after this webinar, attendees will be emailed a link to download your certificate, okay, of attendance. It will go to the same email that you used to get registered for this webinar. If you don't see it, please check your spam or junk folder, okay? Maybe it went that way, right? It went there. Now, certificates are only available for attendees that are here for the live session of the webinar. Also, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone, please, please, please download your certificate within 2 months of today's session. Unfortunately, we don't provide certificates after that. You need to download it within 2 months of today's session. Let's see. Now, before Dr. Bill comes to us with his video camera, I want to tell you a little bit about Dr. Rivers, okay? So he's going to present about again what role do AI and MT have in language access. So let me tell you about Dr. Rivers. Dr. Rivers, a principal for WP Rivers and Associates, has more than 30 years experience in language advocacy and capacity at a national level with significant experience in culture and language for economic development and national security, language access and publications in second and third language acquisition research, proficiency assessment, program evaluation, and language policy development and advocacy. He is the he is the immediate past and founding chair of ASTM Technical Committee F43, Language Services and Products, and chairs the International Standardization Organization Technical Committee 232 on Education and Learning Services. He served as the secretary to the U.S. Technical Advisory Group to the International Standardization Organization. Dr. Rivers serves as a member of the America Language Working Group of the American Academy of Arts and Science. He is an honorary member of the Association of Language Companies, ALC, and a recipient of the ALC Bill Graper Award in 2019. And his bio is very, very extensive. I had to truncate his bio. But anyway, let's please welcome Dr. Bill Rivers. We're so excited that you're here. Thank you so much. I'm going to pause my camera and please, Dr. River, this is
well,
all
thank you,
yours.
Analia and Andrew, for organizing this, and thank you, CCC, for inviting me to speak. And I noticed we have 494 participants, so that's fantastic. And I'm going to try to be honest about AI. The short version of what does AI and MT belong in language access and healthcare, the short version is we don't know yet, and we have to be careful. I'm going to spend the next 40 minutes explaining that at more length. I have this ridiculous bio because I've been in this business for a long time. It's, for the younger folk out there, you just accrete things. Your resume gets longer and longer. It's just a factor of being older. It's not like, I would say I have a very broad and very superficial knowledge about a lot of things in the language world. But with respect to language access, I started working on language access in the fall of 2000. We all remember what happened in August of 2000 when President Clinton signed Executive Order 13166. At the time, the state of Maryland, the General Assembly had proposed a law that would basically take Executive Order 13166 and turn it into Maryland law. And there was pushback. It's going to cost us billions of dollars. We have to translate every scrap of paper into every language. Okay, let's talk about that. Or the more honest pushback, this only matters for certain parts of the state, certain parts of Baltimore, PG County, or Montgomery County. If you're from Maryland, you know what I'm talking about. So the compromise that the General Assembly had was to give the University of Maryland's National Foreign Language Center, where I was assistant director, money to do a needs assessment, a statewide needs assessment, which I did, and found that, of course, every state department had language access requirements in every jurisdiction, and helped draft the bill that became the law eventually in 2005. Took a little bit of time. At the same time, I ended up meeting somebody named Marjorie Bancroft, we were tag teaming training on language access way back when. And I would do the boring part of, all the rules and regulations, et cetera. And she would do the part where she would train managers and state agencies and county offices and frontline workers, like, how do you actually provide language access? This is like 2002, 2003. And that grew into CCC. So I've known of CCC and been happy to worked with CCC for a very long time. And in recent years, after having done a lot of language access work in Maryland, I've done language access plans and policies and ordinances for a number of municipal governments. Going to be working on the state of Maine coming up. So still very much involved in the sort of the middle layer, not being an interpreter anymore. I stopped doing that in 1997. But how do we get language access to the people who need it? And how do we get the people who are supposed to be providing language access to understand their legal obligations and how to do it? So we can then fast forward, and you see my background says Safe AI, and this is the Safe AI task force, which is about the safe role of interpreting. What's the right role for AI in interpreting? And I am chair of this task force, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But there's this, everyone has heard of ChatGPT and this huge launch in March and all the hype. And a lot of pressure on interpreters being asked by their clients, healthcare providers, school systems, well, we aren't going to need you much longer. You hard to deal with, expensive, persnickety, hard to manage interpreters, right? We're gonna replace you with AI. It's like, well, wait a minute. Let's talk about that. Let's really get some clarity on it. At the same time, I'll start my slides now because I'm gonna have to share screen here. So let me get the slides up. I apologize. This might take just a little second. Here we go. Do from start. Come back here and share screen. All right, so we're going to talk about the Interpreting Safe AI Task Force. Stakeholders advocating for fair and ethical AI in interpreting. And, what is this task force? What are we trying to do? What's the purpose of it? I think it's pretty self-explanatory in the name. By the way, my colleague Catherine Allen came up with the name by asking ChatGPT to give us a good acronym. So I'm aware there's some irony in that, but moving on. So I'll talk about the vision, who put this together and why. Structure. Good, I found my first typo on the second slide. Get that out of the way. And then what we're doing next. So the vision it's really basic. Establish, disseminate, promote guidelines for the responsible adoption of AI in interpreting. And we go back and forth. This is interpretation or interpreting. And, I think at one point we argued for like half an hour over the term. I don't care. I can use the Russian term "pidivod," and we just have one word in Russian. So, but anyway, and then the goal is best practice recommendations by the end of this year. But I think that's going to be pushed back significantly because, as with any new undertaking, it's taking more time than we expected. And these are the people who started it, and it's just a motley collection of a company owner like Ludmila Golovina, Catherine Allen from Boostlingo. Many people know Catherine, who's worked extensively with CCC, Carla Fagarin, and some of these folks are on here. I know Eliana Lobo, I saw zoom through the chat. We have interpreters. We have people like Carla, who is former interpreter and was the director of language access for Steward Health, and is now the vice president of the National Council on interpreting in healthcare. We've got Natalia Matarova, who's the executive director of CCHI. Lots of people who are really smart, and then see me down at the end. And we came together because we're getting all of this stuff, and some of us went to conferences in the spring where we were basically being told, like at the Globalization and Localization Association conference in Dublin, AI is going to replace interpreters. You're all going to be out of a job. Now, we've heard this refrain before when machine translation was going to replace translators, 20 years ago, and then neural machine translation and deep learning, et cetera. And so we haven't replaced translators. In fact, we have more people and more work to do in translation. It's different work. But we heard this about, AI is going to replace you guys. And Then we started to get anecdotal reports from the field of, from company owners, from interpreters. Oh, my client school system somewhere in the Midwest, or a small regional health, um, system in the Northeast now has an app that they want to use. And what guidance do I give them? Right. And I don't think this is a good thing. Like, down in my gut, I don't, this is very common frame. We don't think it's a good thing. And I'm trying to be very neutral about this, but to be honest, we really do have to come up with some guidelines. At the same time, the president of the United States, Joe Biden, announced in the spring that the White House was working on an executive order on artificial intelligence. Treating this as a very novel, powerful technology that the people who made it don't quite understand how it works or why it does what it does. That there are lots of different areas in terms of how the government can regulate its use that need attention, and it touches pretty much every part of the government. How will AI be used in education? Are you going to have avatars teaching students? How will it be used in healthcare? AI being used to make diagnoses, and there are certain AI applications that are being used in radiology in particular. So we've got this thing going on where we know there's going to be regulations coming out, and so that executive order was actually issued last Monday, and it gives a whole bunch of different departments, 90, 120, 365 days to come up with various regulations, and it's 111 pages long. Language is not mentioned, and I'll get to that in a second. So we know that the government's going to be putting out regulations. We know Congress will be writing legislation around AI. So we have to get our input together and get it in. And at the same time, so we have these milestones. We launched the work group, the motley crew you saw earlier. We formed a stakeholder assembly. So between the work group launch and the stakeholder assembly, we sent out a survey that had more than 500 responses of people who want to be involved in safe AI. We're launching a perception survey that is behind schedule, and we're going to publish the perception survey results 2 months after the launch. The perception survey should be launched early next week. So we have a governance structure, stakeholder assembly of roughly 60 people representing language companies, interpreter organizations, translation, so ATA, CCHI, for example, individual interpreters, the deaf and hard of hearing community, interpreter trainers for both ASL, ASL and CDI, so certified deaf interpreters on the one hand, and spoken language interpreters on the other, healthcare providers, state regulators, a pretty broad array, academic experts in computational linguistics and MT and so on, where that stakeholder assembly governs the whole effort. And then there's an administrative subset which meets weekly to try to keep all the trains moving on time. And then there are all of these committees. So survey design committee, which has completed the first survey, the design of the first survey, and it's on there twice. I'm sorry, that should be the survey translation committee. We're translating the survey into the 9 most spoken languages in the US, so just following the 2020 census, as well as ASL. There will be an ASL version of the survey. And that's where we're sort of, that's taken a little longer to get all of that work done and check on the quality and so on. Supporter engagement, so people could sign up for one of these many committees. They could sign up to be part of the stakeholder assembly, which is now complete, or they could sign up to be a supporter. And so that's 400 people who want to be involved, and that supporter engagement committee is going to find ways to get them involved. Fundraising, this is we've raised about 60,000 for this, and we're going to have to raise a little bit more to cover the ASL survey and make sure we have ASL interpreters in all of our committees. Research committee, which is going to do some research. I'm not on that committee. Communications, which does all our PR, and guidelines. The guidelines committee is a really important one that will start its work once we get this perception survey back. That will say, okay, these are the use cases. We know there's conference interpreting, and there's different flavors of conference interpreting. We know there's community interpreting. We know there's healthcare language access, educational language access, and there are, again, different nuances within each of those. Like within education, you've got IEP meetings, and you've got school board meetings, and you've got disciplinary meetings, and you've got parent-teacher meetings, right? And then you have language access just on the day-to-day for multilingual students. So the guidelines committee, the first step will be laying out, try to come up with a fairly clear set of these use cases. And the perception survey will help frame that. Like, where is AI currently used, where it could be used, where it should not be used, decision factors to decide whether it's actually safe to use, right? And AI for interpreting, captioning, subtitling, and transcription. So, and that really matters, especially for the deaf and hard of hearing community, where we have cart captioning, we have other types of language access for videos, meetings for the deaf community, in addition to having an ASL interpreter or CDI or both. So beyond just laying out a taxonomy of, because we're all interpreters, we could probably, put it on a sheet of paper, what are the different kinds of interpreting, and, where does it occur, all that. We want to talk about the use of AI and how is it being used, right? So if you look at AI, and so, all right, I mean, reset here. What does AI actually mean? Artificial intelligence, okay? It is basically an algorithm. It's a computer program. And it is not artificial because it's written by people, and it's not intelligent. It does not have anything that we would recognize that a psychologist or a linguist or a philosopher or, a preacher would recognize as sentience, self-awareness, cognition, and, a soul, if you will. Large language models are a evolution of AI. So when you talk about how we got here, you go back to the creation of statistical machine translation, which really started in the late 90s and then was launched after the early aughts, was really brought to the marketplace, where you have two texts, they're lined up, and you send the algorithm to go train it. So the Canadian parliamentary corpus, which has interlined texts that are aligned, it's a very good translation. And so that's partly why French and English was, still one of the stronger language pairs for MT, even though egregious mistakes continue to be made, and even though Google Translate, gendered definite articles and indefinite articles and gendered possessive pronouns drive it nuts. Okay, because but anyway, so high density language pairs have started that machine translation. Then there was neural learning, which is a fancier version, it gives the program an ability to test hypotheses, essentially. And if something doesn't look right, it'll assign that a lower statistical probability and pick something with a higher statistical probability. And then the large language models, where the AI goes off and trains on all the data it can scrape off the internet. And those are predictive text models. That's why when you give ChatGPT a prompt, you say, write me a marketing email. Okay, or here's the characteristics of our task force, give us an acronym. And it'll come up with something, and it's making a prediction as to what the most likely string of text would be. That's a tremendous oversimplification, because how it works is actually very complex and sophisticated. But in the end, it's still a very large statistical learning process. And so what we see with the translation and localization world is, no, the computers did not replace translators. They changed the work tremendously, especially in certain language pairs in certain domains. 35 years ago, this was the translation engine, and the output was initially longhand on yellow legal pads before I scored myself an IBM Selectric Cyrillic ball. And then I had to go buy an IBM Selectric typewriter to go around it. But that and all the beautiful dictionaries that I've got stored in the basement, all that stuff. We use computers tremendously in translation. Not for everything. There's still certain fields, and there's places where the use of raw MT is acceptable for certain things. If you've got, for example, a large, just want to make sure I don't drop, my internet doesn't drop. So if I switch away, I'm just checking the internet. If you've got a large hospitality organization, like, I don't know, Marriott Starwood, which has 10,000 hotels, they actually monitor social media in all sorts of different languages. And if somebody is complaining about a hotel in Washington, D.C., there's 10 or 11 consistent complaints from Chinese tourists or German tourists, that'll be flagged. The algorithm will say, okay, there's something going on here. Give it to a human who looks at it and then decides if there really is something going on that that a human manager needs to deal with. Right. That's one example. And there are lots of different applications now in the translation workflow. We have computer assisted translation. We have translation memory databases, et cetera, et cetera. And those are just apps now. So that's the other thing about AI. Once it's in wide use, it's not really considered AI anymore. Like, everyone uses Waze or Google Maps or Apple Maps, right? That was kind of a revolutionary thing 10 or 15 years ago when it first started to roll out. Now it's like it's built into your phone. Nobody bats an eye. It still does occasionally get things wrong. And interestingly enough, I had a conversation about 7 years ago with the then vice president of research at Google, a fellow named Vinton Cerf, one of the 4 people who helped develop the internet in the early 70s, late 60s and early 70s. And he told me something like, and I'm going to these will be approximate ballpark numbers, that at that time, Google Translate took up more than half of all of Google's computational and memory resources. You think about how big Google is and how many server farms they have and how much computational power they have. And I said, oh, what does Google Maps take up? A smidgen, a percent or something like that. And what that showed is that language is actually really hard. And that also comes into the discussions of AI. It takes a lot of computational power. There are fights in places like, I think, Prince William County, Virginia, the exurbs of DC, about new server farms coming in because they're noisy. They take a lot of power. They take a lot of water to keep the servers cool. So this isn't as there are real physical limitations to AI that aren't going to really matter for our discussion, but it's not free, and it's neither artificial nor intelligent. So that gives you some historical background. Now, we've done this survey. We've designed the questions. A company called CSA, Common Sense Advisory, is actually administering the survey and doing data analysis, and that is going to launch fairly soon. As soon as we get all the translation into the spoken language is done, and the sign language is a little more complex because we will have each question signed, and there will be the ability for the deaf and hard of hearing respondent to either type an answer in or sign an answer, and so that takes a little bit longer to set up. Right. We want to get everybody involved, right? End users, interpreters, technology vendors, regulators, patients, and parents, if we can. And so the task force is right now reaching out to all of its various stakeholder groups, try to get as many people involved as we can in the survey. And the CCC will certainly be contacted once this survey goes out, because 480 people on this Zoom, if I haven't bored anyone to tears yet, we really want to get your opinions as well. So, degree of experience, perceived benefits and drawbacks, what elements to decide whether it's safe for use, and use cases for different specializations. And this is where I want to stop a little bit with language access. It's a settled civil right in the United States that if you are a recipient of federal funding of whatever amount, you have to provide language access to limited English proficient patients, clients, individuals. Is it provided all the time? When it every time it should be provided, we know it isn't. Do all LEP individuals know their rights? Are they all aware of their rights? We know they aren't. Is it always done well? No, but it is a matter of settled civil rights law in the United States. 14th Amendment to the Constitution, due process, equal protection under the law, due process under the Fifth Amendment, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VI, which prohibits discrimination based on national origin, among other protected categories. The case Lau v. Nichols, which had to do with language access in education in 1973. Lau was a Cantonese-speaking family in the San Francisco schools. Nichols was the superintendent of the school district. The Supreme Court interpreted the prohibition on national origin discrimination as extending to a prohibition based on language status. And subsequent cases that have clarified that, then we had the executive order. In 2000, we had the Sandoval case, which actually prompted the executive order that was decided in 2001. And then we have, of course, Section 1557 of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, which enshrines into law, not just an executive order, because any president can revoke an executive order. That's not permanent, although somehow Executive Order 13166 survived the last administration. Minor miracle. But the PPACA, Obamacare, that's law. And it says in healthcare, you must provide language access. MT, machine translation, there's a proposed regulation that would execute Section 1557. So you have the law, and the federal government passes a law. And then whatever department is responsible for faithfully administering the law, in this case, the Department of Health and Human Services, has to develop regulations, the detailed instructions of what has to be done to satisfy the law. And in 2017 or 2018, I forget the exact dates, the previous administration used a spurious legal analysis of how much it costs to provide language access notices to say that it's time to revise this regulation, which is 45 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, Chapter 92, Section 101. That's the language access part. Chapter 92 is all the non-discrimination stuff. What they really wanted to do was strip out protections for LGBTQ plus people, for racial minorities, ethnic minorities, for pregnant women, etc. That was ruled as arbitrary and capricious under something called the Administrative Procedures Act, which actually governs how these regulations are written. But the federal judge in DC let stand the changes to language access. And those included that healthcare providers were no longer required to post notice of rights, that there was no longer a requirement for a healthcare language access coordinator for healthcare providers with more than 50 full-time equivalents, et cetera. So then last summer of 2022, Department of Health and Human Services issued a revised rule to fix all this crap that had been done in the previous administration. One of the requirements in there was, if you are using raw machine translation in healthcare language access, it must be reviewed by a qualified human translator. And there's also an improved set of definitions of what qualified translator and interpreter means elsewhere in the proposed rule. The comments on that closed in August of 2022. It's supposed to be published in February of 2023. They got like 750,000 comments. Each individual comment has to be adjudicated. So they are still working on it. We're told it'll be out by the end of the year. The reason that machine translation is in there is because interesting story. I got a call from a friend whose wife's friend teaches translation at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, and said, can you talk to one of my students? I said, okay, sure. What's up? Just talk to my student. All right. And I'm doing this at a recommendation of a colleague, Joel Gomez, president, Center for Applied Linguistics. And the student said, Dr. Rivers, I have a sentence for you. La vacuna no se necesita. I said, oh, and the original English was, the vaccine is not mandatory. And it turns out the Virginia Department of Health at the time on its website had this sentence, la vacuna no se necesita. So I called a friend of a friend in Richmond who sent this to the local newspaper, who found out that the Richmond, the State Department of Health was using free Google Translate, and then sent it to the National Health Law Program. And they had an intern investigate all 56 state and territorial health departments and found out that 19 of them, or some number like that, were using um, raw machine translation. And that led to a civil rights complaint that is almost done. That will be a consent decree that basically says you can't do that. You got to have a human review it, as well as the regulation. And I'm pausing here and telling you this dilatory story because, as it turns out, there are places where we don't want to use AI. And if you think of MT as a subset of AI, because it is, raw MT still makes mistakes. And it might be 98% correct, but that one sentence, la vacuna no se necesita, does not convey the meaning of the original. And that was, in the context was COVID vaccinations. I think the vaccine is very necessary. I've had 6 of them, because I don't want to get COVID again. Every time I get a booster, it's an individual thing, but I'm totally fine with science and vaccines. I haven't gotten my 5G service yet. I really wish I had. But that was one example. And so then we step back and say, what are the use cases? And it's my personal contention, not speaking now as a chair of Safe AI, but as someone who has been an interpreter, who has been a computational linguist. And I've done, as I said, I've done a whole bunch of different things, not for very long, nor very well, but a whole bunch of different things in the language world over the last 35 years. The AI still makes mistakes. And the kinds of mistakes it makes, and I put that, there's the, everyone's going to get the slides. There's the website. If you want to get involved, you can go to the website. AI makes mistakes, and they're straight up just errors, where it just gets something wrong. It's a mistranslation or a mislabeling of something. But it also hallucinates. It makes stuff up. And a recent study that was published in the New York Times, was a story about this study, was published in the New York Times on Monday. ChatGPT seems to make stuff up about 3% of the time. Google's Bard, 27% of the time. And this was a very straightforward summarize these 3 related news articles, or 3 or 4 related news articles. It was not a complex query. If you are in a situation where, as we say in the language access world, life, health, rights, property, or benefits are at stake, what is a level of acceptable error, number 1, and what kinds of errors can you accept, number 2? We have to admit that human interpreters make errors. However, for an experienced interpreter, and I used to be an experienced interpreter, I knew where my weak spots were. I knew when to ask an interpreting partner for help, or what I needed to brush up on before a conference, and I could recognize mistakes. I had self-awareness to recognize those mistakes. Can't always correct them in the moment, but you can sometimes go back and let the principals know, or let the meeting organizer, whoever you need to know. And that's like in the conference situation, you're sitting in a booth, you got headphones on, you're in a court of law, or you're in, rights, property, benefits, et cetera, at stake. You're in a hospital situation, life and health and rights and benefits and property, et cetera, at stake. What can we tolerate? And in the meantime, I'm going to end the slideshow now. Since the advent of ChatGPT in March, there's been, I had a slide that I couldn't find. No recovery from machine mistakes. Doesn't realize it. There's something called a hype curve that marketing professors talk about, and the hype initially goes way high, and then it comes down like this, because you start to get stories like the lawyer in New York in a federal court case involving somebody suing an airline because he felt that the drink cart had bumped him too hard. It was a trivial, sort of frivolous case. Asked ChatGPT to write a legal brief, and ChatGPT wrote a compelling legal brief. It had 6 different legal citations in it. The problem was none of those citations actually existed. And the federal judge, once the law clerks read the brief and started trying to look up these cases and saw they either didn't exist or one of them was, Smith versus Jones, but had nothing to do with the case at hand, right? Said, what did you do? You let ChatGPT, you did what? Well, I asked it if it was reliable and it said yes. He may well lose his law license. And there's another case in Colorado Springs, apparently in a state course, right? So, I'm always very skeptical. Now, we know, unfortunately, that there will be naive or unscrupulous clients who feel the financial pressure of providing language access, even though they're supposed to. We know it's an unfunded federal mandate for the most part, except for the states that took the partial Medicare reimbursement. And in my other role as a lobbyist, we're working very hard to try to reverse that unfunded mandate part. That's going to take some time. We know that sometimes the decisions on language access are driven solely by how much it costs. And that leads to significant problems with quality, as unqualified interpreters, lousy translations, and unless somebody complains, nothing happens. So I am concerned that there will be mistakes made. That I'm concerned that there will be healthcare systems in particular that take this on. Now, will AI catch up? And I've seen some chat on that. I'm not convinced. In part because, so for example, the large language models train on freely available data on the internet. They've also been scraping data that they shouldn't. So there's going to be some clampdowns on that. If you're using somebody else's copyrighted data, even if you can read it online, you're going to have to pay for it or acknowledge the use, and that's going to slow that down quite a bit. And the EU has already proposed this. The EU regulation is the EU law about AI is like 400 pages long and has way more stuff in it than the American one, which is 113. But even then, it's not clear that the people who create AI understand why it hallucinates. And they've worked very hard to prevent the hallucination. There's the bias question, right? There's who owns the data. If you're installing an AI app for interpreting in a place where HIPAA matters, patient privacy, or FERPA, student privacy, then that has to be a walled garden, because ChatGPT or whatever company is using ChatGPT or BARD or whatever to have an AI interpreting, they don't get the data. They can train on it within that walled garden, but it doesn't go back into the main system because those data are protected. They're protected information under federal law, and the penalties for violating that are actually pretty steep. And no hospital system wants to get caught with that. The AI looks inexpensive now, but I think it will get more expensive. One of the rate limiting factors is the availability of the graphical interface chips, whatever they're called, and they're getting very expensive and scarce. But if we don't understand the hallucination issue, if AI continues to make shit up, and I said that, you can quote me and it's recorded, it may be impressive, it may sound fluid and facile. And if you don't have access to both languages, you will not know if a mistake has been made. But I'm not convinced. So then the analogy to translation and localization: will there be applications of AI that make the interpreter's job easier? Right? That to me is the more interesting question than saying we're going to have an AI, you're just going to talk to an avatar. Oh, and by the way, the data, and this was a presentation at ATA. Currently, the large language models train on data that's about 80% in English, about 15 to 17% is HTML or Python or other types of computer code. And then the rest is split up between images, sounds, and the other 7,000 languages, or the other 3,000 or 2,500 languages that are actually online at any given time. So there's an English language bias built in automatically, right? That that is affects the quality of the AI. There was another study that was done by Google that showed if you like there are these safeguards that are built into AI so that you can't, hey, Chat GPT, tell me how to build a neutron bomb, right? The kinds of dangerous prompts. If you submit those prompts in another language, just plows on ahead. Okay, you know, so I think there's a lot of skepticism, a lot of justified skepticism, and I've been hearing 5 years and $5 billion more investment will get us to the Star Trek Universal Translator. I've been hearing that since I've been in this business since 1988. So anyhow, I'm going on, and we've got a few minutes for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Rivers. Yes, we do have a few questions for you. Let's see. One of them is, I know you're working to a deadline, but does this tie in with the FIT working groups on AI?
Yes, and in fact, Dr. Alan Melby, who is the président de la Fédération Internationale des Traducteurs de North America, FIT-NA, and I'm the past president of FIT-NA. He is part of the effort, and so he is the liaison between what we're doing and what FIT is doing.
Okay, so the next question is, AI is artificial intelligence, but what is MT, the acronym MT?
It's machine translation, and
Okay.
as I said earlier, and I know I put a lot of information out there, you can think of MT as a type of AI if you want, but Google Translate's now an app, and this is what happens when the AI gets a high level of adoption and sort of settles into stable use cases. Just people think of it as an app. Google Translate can be, very useful, and it can really screw things up. Even like I said, even in, so I'm chair of an international standardization organization, technical committee on education and learning. I correspond quite a bit with francophone members of the committee. I write my own letters in French, and then I go back and check them. I've tried to use Google Translate and Chat GPT, and it just comes out much worse than my French. And I'm not a French translator and interpreter, but I grew up speaking French, so
yes.
And so, okay, if I were to pay someone to translate it properly, I'd get a much better product, right? But if it's free, it's worth what you get, worth what you pay for it.
Exactly. Okay, so I'll continue because we do have several questions. Who is going to be responsible, criminally liable, when artificial intelligence makes a mistake?
That is a very good question. And we're seeing this play out right now in terms of civil liability with self-driving cars. The claim is that automated driving is going to make us so much safer, and you can, send your kids off in a pod to their school or their extracurriculars, and you can sit there and read and watch something on an iPad. As a former pilot, I was a student pilot in college. It's a significant misunderstanding of what automation means. As a pilot, you are trained to take over in an instant if something is off or wrong and fly the plane manually. Humans are really bad at sitting for 2 hours and monitoring something. Our minds wander. There have been instances, including a gruesome accident in San Francisco involving Cruise, which is the GM automated driving venture, where a woman was hit by one car at a low speed, and the self-driving car then ran over her and dragged her for 20 feet. And it's not clear that the self-driving cars are safer because the data are incomplete, and the self-driving car companies haven't been particularly willing to share the data with the regulators. The claims are that it's going to be so much safer, but it still makes mistakes, and they're often mistakes that humans would not make. If you're driving a car and you're conscious and sober, you're probably not going to run into a parked fire engine at full speed.
Exactly.
And this happens,
wow.
over and over again. It's not like, it's not like I'm against EVs. I'm not, or automation assistance for certain tasks. But there's a Silicon Valley ethos of move fast and break things. Well, when you start breaking people, that's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
When your product is released to the world and everybody who ever sees a Tesla on the road, you are essentially participating in somebody else's experiment, participating in Elon Musk's experiment about self-driving cars without informed consent, not without really knowing you are. One of the
Mm-hmm.
things that I've proposed within the task force, and I've also proposed to the White House in my other line of work, we have to have safeguards that test this stuff. You couldn't, a Silicon Valley company is not going to say, hey, we've got a new AI powered pacemaker. Let's just start selling it. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, says, slow down now, slow down.
Mm-hmm.
But with respect to language access, it seems like there's no safety testing, no accuracy testing, no reliability. And it's, we have certification programs. We have the CCHI and IMIA. We've got ATA translator certification. There are state court certifications in the US for judicial. There are medical state, certain states have medical interpreter certifications. We actually know how to qualify an interpreter and what a good interpreter should look like and the kinds of
Mm-hmm.
experience, all of this stuff. Does it guarantee that that's going to be mistake free? No. But there are a lot more safeguards in place with the humans than there are right now with AI. And this promise that here's an app, here's an avatar. I've got colleagues who are insisting I'm being a Luddite. I'm not. I'm just being kind of honest about where we are. And
Mm-hmm.
I think the testing is really important because you don't want somebody wrongfully convicted. You don't want somebody, you don't want a medical error to occur because of a misinterpretation. We know these do occur, but they are generally pretty infrequent, and we don't know. We don't have any way to right now to do anything other than trust the vendors of the AI systems. Oh yeah, sure, it's going to be safe. It's just as good as a human. What do you mean by that?
Right.
So
Tragic example. I'm so sorry to hear that. Okay, here's another question. How can we take part of the survey? Is it the same survey sent to us by NCIHC about AI in
no,
interpreting?
it's a new survey that will come out. We hope, knock on wood, next week. We're still working through the translation into other languages because we want patient advocate groups and community-based organizations to get it out to their constituents as well. So you will see it come out from NCICH, CCHI, CCC, ATA. Everybody and their brother is going to be sending you a link to the survey, and we decided that's okay. You're going to, if you're at all engaged with the professional organizations, you're probably going to get multiple requests to take the survey. But we
Mhm.
figured that was better, and as we say in Russian, повторение мать учения, practice makes perfect. But that should be out sometime next week. It'll be out before Thanksgiving for sure in
Okay.
English plus the 9 other languages. And then the ASL will probably be after Thanksgiving because that requires more programming on, we have to put up a website for it and everything else, as opposed to, I don't know what CSA is using. They're using basically a
Mhm.
survey engine, Qualtrics or something like that, and one of the major survey vendors. Um,
Yes.
yeah,
This is wonderful. The more, the better, right?
yeah.
Ways to spread the information. Okay, so here's the next question. Do we expect to see AI powered quality estimation so that the machine interpreter can intervene and ask for clarification?
It's technically feasible. I know that there is some AI work on MT quality evaluation. I don't know where it is. My colleague Alan Melby might have a better sense of that. Um, we're still struggling with, as a community, in terms of evaluating translation, which is, that's a fixed text, right? Um, you know, and there are metrics like BLE, and there's, I think, a successor to that the National Institute of Standards and Technology has for evaluating MT, but it's very self-referential. It doesn't align it, say, with the difficulty level of the text or the proficiency level of the text, if you're talking, in terms of how the government, I mean, three-letter agencies look at the difficulty of a text. Is it a level 2? Is it level 3? Is it level 4? It's and really smart people have been working on this for 25 years, and we're still kind of, in terms of evaluating translation quality or localization quality, is it, there's a holistic approach, and then there's how many errors, and are they major or minor errors? The kind of approach that ATA takes with the certification exam. And la vacuna no se necesita is a major error.
Oh,
and
huge.
that would be if you produce that on your Spanish, English to Spanish ATA certification exam, you've just failed the
Wow.
exam, right?
Exactly.
But a human reader reads that exam. There's still no automated grading. It's all do the exam online nowadays, but it still requires a human to make those congruency judgments. AI may be able to do that. We'll see. I don't think it's, if you look at CSA or NIMSI and, the figures for language access in healthcare, let's say 10 billion a year. I don't have the figure on the top of my head. That's what the people in Silicon Valley, quote unquote, are looking at. That's the market they want to capture, right? On what's being spent on language access in healthcare. I don't think the market on quality control is going to be, very big. And so they're not going to invest in it as much. Researchers work on it, sure. We'll see. I'm not saying it won't happen. It's just the incentives in our economy are not built, for quality control. Move fast and break things.
Okay, Dr. Rivers, we have time for one more question. It's 12:27. Okay, it says, Dr. Rivers, could you speak to the combination use of MT and human translation?
Only in general terms. That'd be a really good to have somebody like Adam Wooten from the Monterey Institute talk to, who teaches this. Like, my experience is that, most translators are using some combination of, computer and web-based tools, and depending on what they're doing. I mean, maybe they're resolving fuzzy matches themselves. Maybe they're just going back and doing post editing, but it really depends. And there are a colleague of mine, Douglas Strock, who owns a company in Midland, Michigan, that specializes in chemical safety data labels, localization of those, right? So it's not just translation, it's the colors have to match, all the regulatory stuff has to match. And if Dow Chemical or DuPont wants to ship a barrel of something to South Korea, right, it has to have the right data safety labels. And he did a test of MT and AI, and MT was, 75 or 80% acceptable, and the AI was in the 30s and 40s, depending on the system. And you'd think that's it's really highly regulated. It's highly technical language. It's not much nuance. And yet even MT was struggling with getting that right. Like, just the names of the chemicals and coming up with that. But, his translators, his independent contractors use whatever tools they use, but they're still involved in it. And I think that's one of the things that we see with technology is that, again, I said, not in jest, that 35 years ago, this was the translation engine, right? It was in between my ears. Nowadays, or the interpreting engine. Nowadays, that might not be the case, especially in translation. But the kinds of tasks that translators are required to do actually are more cognitively demanding, that require higher levels of cultural and linguistic proficiency, because I'm not, translating a contract from Russian into English. I'm comparing the two contracts and making sure that the Russian version does what I want it to do, what the client wants it to do, does what has the same legal effect as what the English version does. 35 years ago, if I got it right, there wasn't the same thing, right? You weren't doing that kind of work, at least in general. And I think, and we see this across the federal government agencies, where they use an enormous amount of technological tools at our three-letter agencies, especially Fort Meade, to process incomprehensibly large data sets to find the nuggets of information that have to be sent to a human for further work. And then the humans are doing an analysis. It's not no longer, was Bill on this webinar? It's like, what did he say? What did he mean? What's his real thinking on this? Where is this
Mhm.
going? And that's the kind of thing now that we're seeing more of, more and more of. I mean, there's still people who, you're translating birth certificates for apostilles. Okay, you know, there's still they're just and technology, at least in translation, created all these new use cases that didn't exist
Mhm.
before. So anyhow, I know we're at time.
Yes, well, Dr. Rivers, we here at CCC are very, very grateful that you have made time to present today to our audience. I know just looking at the chat comments, everybody is just saying amazing presentation. Are we getting the recording? Which people will get the recording? So we just again thank you so much for taking time
Thank
that
you. It's
you
my pleasure.
probably no, well, you're amazing, and we're just very, very grateful for you taking the time to be here today.
Well, thank you, Analia and Andrew and everyone at CCC, and thank you to all the audience members for your excellent questions. I see some of the observations as they fly by in the chat, but it's so many people that it's just too hard to take it all in. But thank you for your attention and stay tuned on Safe AI. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Rivers.